and welcome to another installment of Booking Black with Gary Flowers. I'm glad that you're joining us this evening. Tonight we have a journalist turned author, Margaret Eads, who's written a seminal book in American legal history, We Face the Dawn, the story of attorneys Oliver W. Hill and Spotswood W. Robinson, later Judge Spotswood W. Robinson. As always, on Booking Black with Gary Flowers, we seek to analyze books of national and international import. It can be argued that the duo of Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson not only transformed the southern states of America, but transformed the nation and arguably put an indelible mark on attacking injustices in the legal system around the world. Margaret, welcome to the Gary Flowers. Margaret, welcome to Booking Black with Gary Flowers.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, Gary.
And you know, our story goes back. You were a journalist when I was a special assistant to Governor Wilder here in the Virginia General Assembly when he served as governor in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's just pleasant to see that a journalist can take their skills of research and apply them in a fashion that manifests itself in a book that really can be used as a textbook in many areas of academic endeavor.
Well, it's a wonderful experience to be able to research and write about these two men that were really American heroes, not just Richmond heroes or Virginia heroes, but they had such an impact on our nation, and more people need to know about them.
How many years did you research the book?
I spent probably about 6.5 years working on this, going through archival papers, both Mr. Hill's at Virginia State, the Library of Congress, where the NAACP papers are. I read through all the Afro-American newspapers for the 1940s and 50s. I did a lot of interviews.
Any research at the Moreland Spingarn collection in New York?
Some writing with them, correspondence with them.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, it's a beautifully researched book.
Thank you.
And knowing Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson personally, I think, and I know, captures their personalities, captures their tandem, and captures their impact in a very brilliant way. Mm-hmm. So tell us more about how you came to write the book.
Well, I was a journalist in Virginia for many years, covering state government and politics, and of course, you don't do that in the South without being very well aware of racial issues. And then in 1985, I had a National Journalism Fellowship to travel around the South and look at the results of the Voting Rights Act and its 20th anniversary. And that was such an education. I was in places like Atlanta, where there'd been dramatic change, where there was a black mayor, black council people, and places like Sunflower County, Mississippi, where there was a black majority and still no black elected officials, and all sorts of places in between.
Home to Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yes, yes. And met a lot of people like Benny Thompson and Mike Espy when they were just young people coming up in their communities. They hadn't gotten to Congress yet. It was such an education. And then also in the 1990s, a book was published about Hutton and Williams, a large law firm here in Richmond, and I thought at the time, well, if there was a book about them, there certainly could be a book about this smaller law firm on the other side of Broad Street that actually changed the course of America. So I had the book in mind for a number of years, and then finally, after retiring from the newspaper, I had the time and the continued interest to turn it into a book.
Well, that small law firm, Hill, Tucker & Marsh, very dear to me. In pursuing law, my father set up an unpaid internship, and that matriculated into reading the law at the firm. And so Mr. Hill, in many ways, was a second grandfather to me.
Wonderful.
That's one half of the book. The other half of the book, Judge Robinson and my father grew up on the same block and played tennis together as little boys. My grandfather built a tennis court in the neighborhood of Frederick Douglass Court, the first black subdivision in Richmond, to keep the kids out of mischief. And their pastime was playing tennis. And so I feel as though, and my grandfather built his house at the end of the block from where Judge Robinson grew up. And so when you wrote the book, I just said, wow, this is family to me, but to the world, these are gigantic heroes.
Yes, remarkable men, what they achieved. There are really three reasons that people should know about them. One is they were part of this very small brotherhood around Howard Law School and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that really conceived and executed the strategies that did away with Jim Crow segregation. And they, Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson, were the most significant legal team in the South in working with that group. But then secondly, they had all sorts of really significant court cases, particularly, I guess best known, the Davis case, which became part of, out of Prince Edward County, became part of Brown v. Board of Education, one of those 5 cases, but other significant cases in teacher salary equalization and transportation. And then thirdly, they did a whole, what was called an equalization campaign in the late 1940s, where they went around Virginia, documented the disparities in black and white schools, and then brought legal cases within that. And
the Alston case in Norfolk was one of them.
They had, at one point, they had some 75 cases pending around Virginia, and that was more than in any other state in the
So let's unpack that trilogy, beginning with Dean Charles Hamilton Houston. In many legal circles, one of his most famous quotes is often bantered, and that is that if a black lawyer is not a social engineer, dedicated to changing the structure of society, then he or she is a parasite on society. Dean Houston single-handedly transformed Howard Law School from a day school to from an evening school to a day school. And in 1933, Mr. Hill and Justice Marshall were classmates in that first class. And a cadre of mostly men and later women came through the Howard Law School knowing that their marching orders were to unwrap legal segregation in this country and to dismantle Jim Crow laws. And that they did.
Houston was really the Moses of the movement.
Yes, he was.
Leading the others. And Mr. Hill and Thurgood Marshall were, and as you said, the first class that were the beneficiaries of this transformed curriculum.
And if you think about it, Dean Houston was raised in a middle-class family in Washington, D.C., and had access to an 8mm camera. It was this camera that he took to Clarendon County, South Carolina, as documented in the book Groundwork, the story of Mr. Houston, of Dean Houston's life, and in Simple Justice. And he filmed the disparate conditions for education in South Carolina. White students riding on a school bus to a brick building. Black students from grades 1 to 7, all in one shanty of a shack with no running water. And yet they were both considered separate but equal educational facilities. This fastidious documentation of the unequal application of education in this country was a way that really inflamed Dean Houston. And I've always been of the belief that you can't give off heat if you're not on fire. And so he lit the fires of Hill, Marshall, Nabrett, Hastie, Motley, and other would-be lawyers and judges to dismantle segregation. And then the second point you raised of the cases. The cases that Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson took on were arduous and daunting for any lawyer, let alone one that has to fight off disbarment proceedings on an ongoing basis. So it is as though they were working on hundreds of cases at the same time, all with excellence and precision.
Yes, particularly in the late 1950s after the Brown v. Board decision had come down and there was massive resistance to school integration. There also were all these cases that they were having to bring just to protect their own livelihoods. I mean, they were trying to reopen schools or keep them open, but at the same time, they were having to go back and forth to the Supreme Court just to make sure that they weren't disbarred.
Speaking of back and forth, let's look at the 5 cases that led up. My undergraduate thesis at the University of Virginia was on the 5 cases leading to Brown.
What's it?
And it's interesting, their legal strategy. Dean Houston dies in 1952. He never gets to see Brown versus Board of Education. But he laid the groundwork, literally, for encompassing the 14th Amendment. If the 14th Amendment was the Holy Grail, which granted citizenship to naturally born people in this country, afforded to newly emancipated African Americans in 1868, if the lawyers were to attack the 14th Amendment directly and lose, it would create bad law.
Right.
And that law would last for another 2 or 3 generations.
Right.
And so there had to be a very crafted strategy to literally encircle the 14th Amendment, cases such as Murray and Gaines and others, to say, we're going to take this step by step to make sure when we go after the 14th Amendment, we have the precedents at the lower courts in place.
They had to be extremely careful not to go too soon.
Yes.
To think that they would have the court behind them. And of course, actually, as it turned out, it was really one of those flukes of history that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Vinson, when they were first making the arguments, actually behind the scenes turned out to have been perhaps opposed to making this change. And then he unexpectedly died. And Earl Warren was brought in. Had that not happened, it could have been a very different story, even with all the preparation.
Yes, and I also remember Mr. Hill saying that the case was essentially completed in 1952, but it was a presidential election year. Mm-hmm. And that Justice Frankfurter wisely noted that the case would be a political football.
Right.
For Eisenhower and, who was the other candidate? Well, for Eisenhower, it was a political football. Stevenson, yes. And as such, the case was delayed until 1953, going into 1954, so as to take away the politicalization.
Frankfurter has a famous quote in which he said, after the death of Vincent, this is the first real evidence I've ever had that there is a God.
And that type of background story is what you most arduously pulled out in your research. And that's what makes this book so critical to any student who's looking at the legal history in this country. I would argue that the first book would be Higginbotham's In the Matter of Color, looking at the history of African Americans from their detainment and captivity in 1619. And the second book, Simple Justice. But I'm arguing, whether you ever read Groundwork, which I think you should, of Dean Houston, that We Face the Dawn has to be read. And so here we are now looking at these two men. Tell us about Judge Robinson, his stature, his personality, and that of Attorney Hill.
Well, they were such opposites, really, yes. And that they had a friendship, I think, was based on mutual respect, probably somewhat because of their differences. Mr. Hill was sort of an alpha male, a larger-than-life figure. He walked into a room and you immediately knew he was there. He could be commanding, he could be demanding. He was also extremely generous with his time.
Yes.
Just a grand person, and who really was pretty much the face and soul of the civil rights movement in Virginia for many years. Judge Robinson, on the other hand, was much more like an accountant in both appearance and demeanor. He was very precise, extreme attention to detail, really a workaholic.
Yes.
He would come home late at night, be up early in the morning, constantly working to bring things to perfection, and they were a good team in balancing those characteristics.
Mr. Hill, I have such fond memories. I asked Mrs. Hill, Mrs. Bernasenia Hill, how they met, and she said, I was peering out of my window, and this bon vivant was strolling down the street, and I didn't know what a bon vivant was at that time. And I said, well, why were you in the window, Mrs. Hill? Well, I don't know why I was in the window, but I would see this bon vivant. And she said so glowingly how he approached her at a party, and she said thanks but no thanks. And essentially, as my father would say, she chased him until he caught her.
Well, she grew up in a very straight-laced church-going family, yes. And he had a very sort of freewheeling yes. young adulthood. And he says that her mother was really thought he was too wild for
he was a sports fanatic. He was an athlete. He was a member of Omega Psi Phi fraternity, to which Judge Robinson was as well. So they had a fraternal bond, and they had a friendship that went beyond the law. But Mr. Hill was just that larger-than-life figure. But yet, he was very humble in his pursuit of the law. When you walked into his office at Hill, Tucker and Marsh, there were no plaques or trophies or anything other than a stack of legal files. Mm-hmm. And it spoke to his humility. Now, he had plaques and all of that at the house because Mrs. Hill put them up. But his spirit was, we've got to get it done. Yeah. Judge Robinson, fastidious, I mean, to the nth detail. And you bring out these two personalities well. Talk more about their early cases when Judge Robinson comes out of Howard Law School.
Judge Robinson graduated in '39, 6 years after, and almost immediately was put on the faculty there because of the yes. war. They were really short of people. And he became a real protege of Charles Hamilton Houston's, working because he had done a major paper on restrictive covenants, yes. and Houston knew about that, and housing was Houston's really great love, and so they worked closely together on that. Now, Judge Robinson, as perfect as he was, and he had come out of Howard Law School with the highest grade point average, reputed to be in the history of the law school.
Which lasted
till 2010.
Yes, recently.
Right, I documented that in the work. But he had this hang-up about taking the bar exam, yes. and so he did not take it for several years. I think it was because he thought he had to know everything, yes. that he had to be prepared, and of course that was impossible. But then Mr. Hill is getting ready to be drafted into World War II, and the work that he's doing with the Virginia Conference of the NAACP, yes. someone has to take over that. And so Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson's father come up with a plan that they're going to make him take that bar exam, and then he's going to come and take over the law firm. And so he did, and he, of course, immediately passed it. And so it was really as Oliver Hill was leaving Richmond that Judge Robinson came to the law firm.
Yes.
And he had during that time the Irene Morgan case,
yes.
While Mr. Hill was away,
yes.
which was a really significant case 10 years before Rosa Parks.
Yeah, talk more about the Morgan case.
Okay, well, Irene Morgan had, she lived in Baltimore, and she had come to Virginia to recover from a tubal pregnancy. And going back to Baltimore, she's tired, she's exhausted, she's told she has to move to the back of the bus, and she says, no way. And so she has sort of a physical altercation in Saluda with the sheriff, which is not a good thing to happen.
No, definitely not in Saluda.
So she is arrested. But the case, what they establish is that in interstate transportation, because she was going from Virginia to Baltimore, that it struck down state regulations in terms of requiring separate seats. Now, what happened after that was that they determined the transportation companies could have their own rules. Yes. So it didn't entirely eliminate things, but it was a major step forward yes. to say that in interstate transportation, you could not have state prohibitions
racially
based on
separated
race.
seats.
That's
yes.
right. Yeah.
And so then the Morgan case comes up, and Mr. Hill goes off to war.
Right.
And Judge Robinson steps in. And you're right, I think he wanted to get a perfect score. And he thought if he didn't get a perfect score, he shouldn't take the bar.
Right.
And that was his mentality toward every case.
Right. And the downside of that was when that case then reached the Supreme Court, he had not been a lawyer long enough to be able to argue it. So he sat there at the table with Thurgood Marshall and Bill Hasty, but it was the two of them who did it. But he, of course, knew all the background and
had done all the research.
Had done all the work. So
my uncle, my father's brother, lived in what was known as Brookfield Gardens, and that is where Judge Robinson lived. And studying and preparing for Brown versus Board of Education, my uncle used to fondly say that the lights were on all night.
And one of the things that I found in doing this was that he almost had a physical breakdown because of the lights staying on all night. There were two major hearings before the May 1954 decision, and Judge Robinson was assigned by Thurgood Marshall the task of perfecting the briefs for those cases. Huge task for someone, particularly who was so meticulous and so careful. And
that's why they chose him.
Right. And then he argued the Virginia portion of those cases, and he almost was in a state of total collapse at the end of that 1953 hearing. And there were papers that became available really sort of at the end of my research. The Legal Defense Fund had been in negotiation with the Library of Congress about releasing some of these papers, and there were letters from Thurgood Marshall saying we can't just let him kill himself, and Lester Bangs, who was saying we need to start a vacation fund.
Yes, Mr. Hill and Justice Marshall would at least take a food and liquid break from time to time, or talk about the football game over the weekend. And they kind of had a more well-rounded perspective on the law, whereas Judge Robinson, it was the law, noon, breakfast, and dinner.
Now it's like these men are such heroes, but it's easy to forget the climate in which they were operating. And, there was financial strain, there was physical collapse perhaps, and all sorts of mental anguish for the families. Mr. Hill particularly was fearless, but his family was not. And his wife, Bernie, would sit at the door, she said, some nights with a gun, waiting for him to come home.
And would use it if it were not he on the porch.
Well, her son says she didn't know which end to shoot from.
I believe in Miss Bernie. She would have figured it out.
She would have figured it out.
And the toll on families was horrific. But speaking of the temerity of Mr. Hill, he finally told me one time that in the small circuits outside of the large cities in Virginia, you had to be admitted to that circuit court, that local court, by a member of that bar, which essentially required that if a lawyer didn't know you in the county, or if the lawyer had any prejudices against you for skin color or anything else, you would not be able to argue in the court. Mr. Hill, knowing this, mind you, he's 6'3", and he walks into the courtroom and stands before the judge and moves the admission of Oliver W. Hill. And so the judge is sifting through the papers, and he looks down and he says, well, is that you? And Mr. Hill said yes. And he said the judge turned beet red because he was so flabbergasted that a black lawyer would have the gall to walk into his courtroom and move his own admission, that he said, anyone that has that much gall, so granted.
You can do it, yeah. That was an early case with Phil, and that stayed with him, I think. And he had prepared for this case, and really there was a chance that he wouldn't have been able to present it. He said that he got there and he asked the Commonwealth's attorney to move for his admission to the bar, and the Commonwealth's attorney said, I don't know you, and he wasn't going to do it, so Mr. Hill said, well, then I'll do it myself.
And even before that, Mr. Hill had become the first African-American to sit on the Richmond City Council in 1948, and in so doing, he was often not included in the political caucuses or meetings. And without invitation, he'd show up.
Yes. He had a great deal of confidence.
Yes. And everyone would just stop and look like, wow, he's here. And he would just begin shaking hands and talking to everyone. Looking at the legal impact of the work that they did that you so eloquently document in We Face the Dawn, it was their work principally that gave the Northeast, and represented by Justice Marshall and others, the legal footing to take cases on. When I talked to Judge Damon Keith and others around the country, Judge Motley, they talk about looking at Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson as superheroes in the courtroom, and in the law stacks, that let them know that there was a seriousness in their scholarship. Talk about Governor Wilder as a young lawyer coming to work for Judge Robinson.
Okay, well, he came back to Richmond and he had an informal relationship. They weren't in a partnership, but he would help him with various cases. And Governor Wilder likes this. Well, one, he told me that Judge Robinson had built the bookcases in his office, and he had built them to such exact height that dust could not filter onto the tops of the books.
That's Judge Robinson.
So he said he would prepare a brief and he would present it to Judge Robinson. You know, this is before he was a judge, so it was Mr. Robinson. But he would say, all right now, let's see, let's go over this. And I think this word notwithstanding, we need another word for that. And then he would just keep going. And 2 hours later.
It's bleeding red.
Bleeding red. But Charles Hamilton Houston had done the same thing with Mr. Robinson.
Yeah.
And so he was carrying on that tradition of saying, you need to strive for perfection.
Yes. And that lasted through Governor Wilder's career, becoming the first African-American elected governor in the United States.
Yes.
And serving as a special assistant on his staff, he was fastidious. You did not approach him unless you had dotted your I's and crossed your T's, or it would not end well. And that is the spirit of Dean Houston and Judge Robinson applied through Governor Wilder. And so when we look at the book that you've done, do you have plans for another book? And where may we find your book?
Well, from any bookstore.
Any
If
bookstore,
they don't have
okay.
it there, they can order it for you very
University
quickly.
of Virginia
It's
Press.
University of Virginia Press. You can also get it from the university, but
Yes.
you can get it on Amazon and any of the other.
Do you have plans for another book?
I don't know. We'll see.
We'll see. Okay.
I'm working on a piece right now for Encyclopedia Virginia about Barbara Johns.
Yes.
Of course, that's interesting to do.
And it's interesting that the Civil Rights Monument on Capitol Square includes Barbara Johns and a portrait of her classmates.
She, of course, was, your listeners probably know, but she was the 16-year-old student who led the walkout at Moton High in Farmville, which became part of the Brown v. Board case.
The Davis portion of the Brown case.
Yes.
And so on that same granite monument are images of Mr. Hill and Judge Robinson.
Yes. Yes.
And I remember that hot day when it was dedicated. It seemed like it was 2,000 degrees out there, but Mrs. Judith Anderson was very much a principal in bringing that statue to Capitol Square here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we thank her for that.
And now markers for both of these men at the foot of Capitol Square. As you go in, they'll be behind the courthouse there, but facing the Capitol.
On the northern side of the former district court, now the Fourth Circuit of Appeals, and so history markers are there. And I just want to congratulate you once again on the work that you've put in to this most needed book, because Mr. Hill and Mr. Tucker have been mentioned in other books, but never had the focus on them.
Well, it was a joy.
And so as we go forward, we look forward to your next book.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you for tuning in to Booking Black with Gary Flowers. We hope to see you next week. Good evening.